Hello, everybody, and welcome to our new bank holiday. It's really exciting to be here doing a Goldster event. When we realized it was going to be a bank holiday, we decided we put it at 9 o'clock, and I thought, oh, I hope people turn up. So it's really great to see so many of you here today. I'm going to be talking to you today about one of my books. I'm actually wearing red, white, and blue, but it's not showing up properly. There we are. I've got the appropriate colors on. I'm going to be talking to you today about this book, Elizabeth Revealed. And you are welcome to unmute yourselves today. Ben, I hope you heard that people are allowed to unmute themselves today. We can have a chat if we want to, but I'm also going to share my screen in a moment. I'm just going to get my PowerPoint up. So, sorry, we had a bit of a tech problem with me getting in this morning for some reason. It didn't want to let me in to do my own talk. So I'm just going to share, I'm going to let some more people in. They're coming in thick and fast. I hope you're all enjoying having these extra 2 days, by the way, because I think it's very exciting to have a whole extra 2 days of, I was about to say of not working, but I'm here with you all this morning. So I'm just going to start off talking a little bit about this book and about how I was asked to write it. So this is a book that I was approached to do by Historic Royal Palaces a couple of years ago. And I was rather surprised because one of my previous books had been a biography of Princess Louise, who was Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's daughter, a sculptor. And it was not well received by the Royal Archives, who have closed off her files. I was not able to go and actually research, I should say, I was about to say investigate in the Royal Archives. So I had to write this other book completely without assistance from the Royal Archives. So when Historic Royal Palaces approached me to write this book, they said that I'd been recommended by Lucy Worsley, who of course at the time was head of HRP, Historic Royal Palaces. And she'd also written a really lovely review of my Princess Louise book. So I thought, wow, this is amazing. The editor came to meet me, and when she arrived, she said to me rather worriedly, I've been reading your Princess Louise book on the bus on the way here, and I hadn't realized how controversial it was. And I said, yeah, I was a little bit surprised at being asked, but if you're happy for me to do it, then I'm very happy to write the book, but you better go away and check whether I'm going to be vetoed. And she came back and she said, no, they'd love you to write the book, which confirmed what I'd been told, which is that the Royal Archives and the royal family themselves are just completely separate. And the Royal Archives are very much kept as a separate business, although they're inside Windsor Castle. And this was, I found, a really fascinating book to write. Most of my books kind of end with the early 20th century, the kind of Bloomsbury and suffrage eras. And so to write a book from the 1950s onwards, well, starting with the Queen's birth, actually from the 1920s onwards, was really fascinating. It taught me a great deal about my own country, and I learned some really fascinating things. So I just wanted to share a few of these wonderful images with you. They're not completely up to date. I haven't got any from the most recent images, because all of these images are courtesy of Historic Royal Palaces, so I can't add anything extra onto this presentation. But as you can see, there's some really gorgeous images in here. Please do put things in the chat, and please do unmute yourselves if you can. Ben, I'm hoping you've allowed people to unmute themselves, because I don't think I'll see the chat while I'm sharing this. But what I will do is I will, thank you, Ben, I've got a thumbs up there. I will also check the chat at the end. So I'm just going to start off with showing you an image of the Queen's father as a little boy. He was known as Prince Albert, as Bertie in the family, although of course when he became king, he chose to be King George VI. And this must have had she been aware of it, Queen Victoria would have been fuming about this, because she named her eldest son Albert in the hopes that although her husband, his father, Prince Albert, was never allowed to be king, he always had to be Prince Consort. She was determined that her son, who would inherit the throne, would turn the name Albert into a king's name. And he, of course, chose to be King Edward VII. And yet, here she is. Here there is, a couple of generations down, another Prince Albert who chooses to be King George VI. He was born at York Cottage in Sandringham on the 14th of December, 1895. So still during Queen Victoria's lifetime. And as you may be aware, he was afflicted with a stammer and a speech impediment. And some of you may have seen the film The King's Speech, a film I really enjoyed, where he worked with a speech therapist called Lionel Logue, an Australian, based on a true story. And I found it really fascinating. Any of you from Surrey, this is the future king, although not realizing it at the time. At the time, he was just simply the Duke of York. In 1922, at a fete at Great Bookham in Surrey. And of course, he was never intended to be king. His older brother, David, was intended to be king. Here we have a souvenir of the Queen's parents' wedding. So this is the Duke of York and Lady Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon. He actually had to propose to her 3 times. She turned him down the first 2 times because she just obviously realized what the kind of responsibilities there would be of becoming his wife and entering the royal family proper. She was very closely connected with them through ties and friendship and family links, but she wasn't actually a royal at this point, and she really had to think seriously. So he proposed for the 3rd time, and she finally said yes. And their first daughter, Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, was born on the 21st of April, 1926, almost exactly 3 years after their wedding took place, on the 26th of April, 1923. And that perhaps suggests at that time that they had had some difficulty in having a child. She was born at 17 Bruton Street in Mayfair, which sadly no longer stands. It's been taken away by the developers, which is a great pity. I think it's such a pity that the Queen's birthplace isn't standing. And she was born by caesarean section. And a very simple statement was issued by Buckingham Palace. The Duchess of York was safely delivered of a princess at 2:40 this morning. Both mother and daughter are doing well. I think this is such a sweet picture. This is the present Queen at 15 months old. And her father, the Duke of York, wrote, "We have long wanted a child to make our happiness complete." Her grandmother, Queen Mary, recorded in her diary that her new granddaughter was a little darling with a lovely complexion and fair hair, and she was known in the family as Lilibet. Now, she'd been named Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary. That was honouring her mother, her grandmother, and her great-grandmother. So here she was, as I'm just going to omit a couple of people. Yeah. Here she is at King's Cross Station in London. And this is with her childhood nurse, who was known by the nickname of Allah. Her name was actually Clara Knight, and she had been the Queen Mother's childhood nurse. So it's quite often happened in families. So the nanny who'd looked after the mother would then come back to look after that woman's children herself. And I think this is a really wonderful picture, the way the photographer has captured it, with the little girl's features really standing out, with almost everything behind her blurred. Now, when Princess Elizabeth was 9 months old, her parents went on a 6-month tour, obviously without her, as was quite standard at the time. They went to Latin America through the Panama Canal and to Fiji, New Zealand, and Australia. They were given so many baby presents that one estimate said the presents weighed 3 tons. And so Allah and the little girl's grandparents, the King and Queen, looked after her in her parents' absence. So this picture was taken in 1929. And here you can see the Queen with her little sister, Princess Margaret Rose. We tend to think of her as Princess Margaret, but actually in the family, she seems to have been called Rose as the little girl. I think she has a very sweet, cheeky little face here. This is their governess, Marion Crawford, known as Crawfie. And Crawfie was really interesting. She was studying to become a teacher and was training in child psychology. When she met the Duke and Duchess of York, they were on holiday with a family for whom she was working during her summer holidays, looking after their children. And they were so impressed with her intelligence and how brilliant she was with the children that they asked her to give up her studies and come and work with them permanently with their children. She stayed with the family until 1947. And that is the year that Princess Elizabeth got married. Allegedly, Crawfie had been planning her own wedding for 16 years, but putting it off until Princess Elizabeth was safely married and she could then leave and get married herself. Just 3 years later, in 1950, she published a book, an unauthorized book, unfortunately, entitled The Little Princesses. It doesn't seem to have had anything scandalous. It seems to have been a rather loving portrait, but very sadly, because it was unauthorized, it caused a huge estrangement between Crawfie and the family. Now, for anybody from Wales, I don't know if you're aware that you actually gave Princess Elizabeth this little cottage. It's known as the Welsh Cottage. It was a miniature house in the grounds of Windsor Great Park. And it was given to Princess Elizabeth as a birthday gift by the people of Wales in 1932. So I don't know if you were aware of that, people in Wales, but you gave her that. And this is one of my favorite images of the Queen because it's by an artist whose work I absolutely love. This is by a most wonderful artist called Philip de Laszlo. And he was born in 1869 and died in 1937. So this is very much towards the end of his life. And this is the present Queen at the age of 7. Now, I love the work of Philip de Laszlo. His work was just exquisite. And a few years ago, there was a beautiful exhibition of his work at the National Portrait Gallery, and I've never forgotten seeing how gorgeous it was. And in fact, he painted a really stunning portrait of Princess Louise, the one I mentioned earlier, whose biography I wrote, a really gorgeous image of her very much towards the end of her life. And I wish I could have put them side by side because they're two such gorgeous examples of his work. Now, she did not go to school and she was educated at home. One of her tutors was Henry Martin, the vice provost of Eton College. And her education had to change a great deal once it was realized that she was actually going to become the Queen. Because, of course, when she was a little girl, initially, people just thought she was just going to remain a young princess and didn't need to have that kind of education. After all, she was a girl. Why did she need a decent education? I love this miniature. I don't think you can call this a pony. It looks like such a miniature horse. It looks so perfectly in proportion. And here is Princess Elizabeth riding in Windsor Great Park in 1934. Now, she'd always loved horses right from the beginning of her life. And one of my favorite stories about her is that when she was a child, she declared that if she were Queen, of course, at this point, she had no idea she would be. She said if she were Queen, she would pass a law that meant that horses had to have a day off work every Sunday. Now, of course, this makes me realise that this is long before the motor car took over. There were a few motor cars, but still the main vehicle on the streets of Britain was a horse-drawn vehicle. And she really hated the fact that they had to work 7 days a week. She was very, very close to her grandfather, King George V, who most people, including his own children, were terrified of. David, her uncle, the King Edward VIII, who was never crowned, he actually mentioned once of how terrified he was of his father. But however, Princess Elizabeth had him wrapped around her little finger. And there was one day when the Archbishop of Canterbury came to visit, and he apparently found the monarch crawling on all fours while his granddaughter was walking in front of him, holding his beard and leading him while he pretended to be a horse. I just have this wonderful image of what did the Archbishop of Canterbury do? Did he have to get down on all fours as well and be a horse? I don't know. I just love that image of this little princess pulling her grandfather around by his beard and him perhaps neighing like a horse. She called him Grandpa England, which I think is a really sweet name for, you know, her grandfather, who was the monarch of Britain. Here you see Princess Elizabeth and some friends at a birthday party, and a little girl who's in the same matching kilt, so second in from the left, if you're looking at it the same way I am, that's Princess Margaret. And now, she was born on the 21st of August, 1930, when Princess Elizabeth was 4 years old. And Princess Margaret was born at Glamis Castle in Scotland. And of course, for those of you who know your Shakespeare, you'll know that this is the castle mentioned in Macbeth. And I might say that I actually trespassed there once when I was trying to show some friends from Australia around, and the castle was closed, and we walked through the grounds and got spotted by the owner, who we actually managed to charm into telling us about it when I told her these people had come all the way from Australia. So I have very good memories of that. This is when Princess Margaret was born. This was when the Home Secretary had to be in the room at the birth, which just must have been horrendous for the Queen giving birth. But of course, they had to make sure there was no imposter smuggled in. So the Home Secretary at the time was a man called J.R. Clines, and he wrote of the new baby, "I am glad to say that she has large blue eyes and a will of iron, which is all the equipment a lady needs." So this was, of course, 1930. Perhaps the same could be said of me, I don't know. Here we have Princess Elizabeth with her dogs in the garden of 145 Piccadilly in 1936, the year that she turned 10. Now, I mentioned horses earlier, but dogs were always a really, really important feature of Princess Elizabeth's life. And I think we all know how much she still adores her dogs today. In fact, at the moment, if you're in London, there's a special corgi trail of corgi statues around parts of Westminster that you can go and find all these different corgis in London. And they grew, when she was a little girl, they moved from Bruton Street to 145 Piccadilly. Again, sadly, a house that doesn't survive. It was a victim of the Second World War and was destroyed by bombs in the Blitz. but this was the most incredible building. It had 25 bedrooms, a ballroom and a lift, which at that time was really unusual. And because they lived so near several of the parks, the young Elizabeth would be taken, and Margaret Rose would be taken by their nanny into the royal parks regularly. Here is the Queen's uncle, who they knew as David, who we really think of as King Edward VIII. In 1936, during his brief reign, of course, he was named king after the death of his father, the present Queen's grandfather, but he was never actually crowned. And he nicknamed his niece Shirley Temple because of her curly hair. On the 20th of January 1936, that was the day that his father died, and he was named the new king, but he abdicated on the 11th of December 1936, 6 months before his coronation. And of course, all the coronation sellers, the kind of official souvenir sellers, were left with huge stocks of things they couldn't sell. They're probably worth an absolute fortune today if you collect china and things. I remember before Prince William got married, I remember there was a story in the newspaper about somebody who'd produced loads of memorabilia with images of Kate and Prince Harry, because they got the wrong prince. So I often think it's a bit like that, those things that, you know, the souvenir sellers don't know what to do with. So this is the coronation of Princess Elizabeth's parents, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, who we all probably better know as Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Happened on the 12th of May, 1937, and it was the first major royal occasion that Princess Elizabeth attended. Now, she wrote a long piece about it. It's rather fascinating to see what she wrote in her diary about this. And one of the things that I noted was these little coronets that the two girls are wearing. They were not the coronets they were meant to be wearing. They arrived and they were such heavy gold coronets that they really hurt. And so they had special new ones made out of silver gilt that were hurriedly constructed for the little girls to wear. After the coronation, she wrote in her diary that Westminster Abbey was a sort of haze of wonder as Papa was crowned. At least I thought so. Now, here we see a cover of Woman's Own from 1937. And these were known as the pin-up princesses. And everybody around the world wanted to see pictures of these two little girls. So following the coronation, Queen Mary, Elizabeth's grandmother, insisted that her education needed to be improved because now she was in training to become queen. Now, the new king and queen had always hoped to have more children and to have a boy, because of course that was at the time he would have become king over his older sisters. However, that was not to be. And very early on, they started to become kind of icons for little girls or children growing up at the time. In 1940, when Buckingham Palace was hit by a bomb, the princesses were not there. They were actually in a secret location. But a few weeks later, they made a radio broadcast aimed at other children. They appeared on the BBC programme Children's Hour, recorded at Buckingham Palace, which had been bombed. And the future Queen's speech included lines, "I want you all to be very good and to do just as you're told and take great care of your gas masks. I've got one too. I've been trying it on and I looked so funny in it that Rose laughed and laughed until she nearly cried." During the war, they were actually kept at Windsor Castle, but nobody knew they were there. The government wanted to send them away to Canada, but their mother said no, she did not want to be parted from them. So one of the things the girls did was they put on charity performances for members of the royal household to raise money for the Queen's Wool Fund, which was to buy uniforms for the troops. And this shows them in Aladdin and the Princess in 1943, with Queen Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth as she was at the time, playing the kind of that principal boy role, and Princess Margaret as the princess. Then moving forward a few years, I think this is absolutely stunning. I think that dress designers' drawings for their designs are such wonderful works of art. Every now and then I've been to an art exhibition where they've included them, and they're just beautiful. This is Norman Hartnell's successful design for the wedding dress of Queen Elizabeth, or Princess Elizabeth, when she married naval officer Philip Mountbatten, Prince of Greece. Now, this was in 1947 that she announced her engagement. She had apparently fallen in love with him, although he didn't really notice her, when she was 13, the first time she met him, when she went with her father to visit a naval ship. Many designers submitted designs for this. And in fact, Norman Hartnell himself submitted 12 designs, but this was the one that was chosen, and only 3 months before the wedding. 350 dressmakers worked on making the dress. It took them 7 weeks. And this is the wedding party. It was a very bright moment in a Britain that had been so recently ravaged by war and that was still having rationing. There were 8 bridesmaids, including Princess Margaret, and the ceremony at Westminster Abbey was broadcast live on radio to 42 countries, as well as being filmed and shown on BBC TV that evening. Princess Elizabeth famously saved up her clothing coupons because, of course, everything was still rationed. She was allotted an extra 100 coupons, and her bridesmaids and page boys were also given extra clothing coupons. And here she is in her wedding dress. Now, in a very sensitive post-war Britain, and I was fascinated by this, questions were asked about the creation of the dress. Where had the silk come from? Now, Norman Hartnell had very carefully ordered the silk from a Scottish firm, but what people wanted to know was, where did the silkworms come from? Were they from Japan, a wartime enemy? And Hartnell had to confirm that they were Chinese worms from nationalist China. The bride also wore Queen Mary's tiara that you can see here as her something borrowed, and the silk in the train actually came from English silkworms in Kent, so it was all right there. It's fascinating to look and see how much fashion is political. And then here are some of the ration beating ingredients for the cake. For anybody from Australia, this was the Australian Girl Guide's contribution, because they knew that Britain was still having rationing. Now, the reason the Girl Guides were so interested is that Princess Elizabeth had been a Girl Guide herself. And she was desperate to join the Girl Guides, but she wasn't allowed to join a public pack. It was too dangerous. So her governess, Crawford, had set up her own troop, carefully choosing a few female friends and a guide leader whose name was Miss Violet Synge. And Elizabeth was 11 when they formed the first Buckingham Palace Guide Company. And Elizabeth begged for her sister to be able to join, although she was only 7. And she told Miss Synge that Margaret had a fine pair of hiking legs and added, she loves getting dirty, which I reckon is a description that must have dogged Princess Margaret for the rest of her life. Now, because she was only 7, she wasn't allowed to be a bride, so they set up a brownies group as well at Buckingham Palace. And because Princess Elizabeth was probably one of the most famous Girl Guides in the world, Australia decided that they would contribute to her wedding cake by sending over the ingredients that we couldn't get in Britain during rationing. And here is the finishing touch being made to the 9-foot-high wedding cake. This wasn't the only wedding cake, by the way. There were 12 wedding cakes in total. Slices of cake were sent all over the country to charities, to schools, to hospitals, and for patients and staff all over Britain. And then there's a souvenir jigsaw puzzle. I wonder how many of you might have one of these to commemorate the birth of Prince Charles. Now, I haven't put many images of the royal children in this. There are many more in the book. I think this is wonderful. I love this jigsaw puzzle. I think this would be a great thing to have. And just to say that, of course, the Queen and Prince Philip would go on to have 4 children, but to have them slightly staggered in ages. And that became deeply fashionable to follow the Queen's example of having 2 families, to have 2 together, then a gap and another 2. I think this is a really gorgeous picture of the family. So here you see Prince Philip holding Prince Charles and the Queen holding Princess Anne, who was, I have to say, really, really sweet baby. This is in the grounds of their London home, Clarence House, which is now the official home of Prince Charles and Camilla. And this was in the summer of 1951. So at this stage, her father was king, but nobody, including the king himself, had been told that he had lung cancer. I found it absolutely extraordinary that medics decided not to tell the king that what he was suffering from was lung cancer. I don't know how they had the authorization to make that decision. It seems really strange. In 1969, some years later, having been advised to become much more modern, the royal family would agree to take part in a TV documentary. A BBC film crew filmed them for 18 months. And the plan backfired. It was basically really uncomfortably close to kind of today's reality TV. Prince Charles and Princess Anne were just kind of really stroppy, kind of adolescent. It's quite hilarious. And there was a BBC controller who was really against this. And he advised them not to do it. He said that it would damage the monarchy. That BBC controller was a young man called David Attenborough. And he and the Queen have been really good friends ever since. You might have seen they did a fantastic program together a couple of years ago on trees. And I just think it's really amazing that that friendship began from that early on. I'm going to go on to the next section. I'm not going to do the full slide because I want to be able to chat to you all. I'm just going to show you some of the rulers that she's met in her reign and famous people. So here is the Queen with the Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia in 1954. The Queen first met the Emperor of Ethiopia on his visit to London on this particular occasion in 1954. And then in 1965, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh made a state visit to Ethiopia. And something I found really fascinating here is they were welcomed at the airport by the Emperor and then given a state dinner at his old palace, in the gardens of which were kept Haile Selassie's pet lions. How amazing is that? And this is the Queen with Sir Winston Churchill and his wife, Lady Churchill. Now, he was the Queen's first Prime Minister. He'd obviously known her since babyhood, and he became a really valued friend. Their weekly meetings, of course, the Queen has a weekly meeting with all her prime ministers, but it was noted that these meetings lasted a really long time. And so eventually a curious interviewer asked what they talked about, and Churchill replied, oh, mostly racing. So obviously they got the affairs of state out of the way really quickly, and then just went on to the important business, talking about horse racing. This is with Prince Charles in Wales at Carnarvon Castle on the 1st of July 1969. Thousands of people attended the ceremony in person and millions watched it around the world. This was when Prince Charles was 21 years old. Now, this commemorates a very controversial visit. This is the Queen with the visiting Emperor Hirohito of Japan and his wife, Nagako, and I apologize to any Japanese speakers, I've just ruined those names, I apologize. This state visit in 1971, as I said, was extremely controversial because it was, the war was in such recent memory. And the New York Times wrote a really fascinating article. I was really intrigued to read it. The journalist who was in London wrote in the New York Times that the crowds were unusually quiet. So people turned out in force and lined the streets as always, but were very, very silent. And at the official dinner, Queen made, I think, a really important speech. She commented, "We cannot pretend that the relations between our two peoples have always been peaceful and friendly. However, it is precisely this experience which should make us all the more determined never to let this happen again." And I think that's a really important thing to realize in diplomacy, just how important this was. Now, here you see the Queen riding with Ronald Reagan when he was president in the grounds of Windsor Castle. And the two equestrians, of course, bonded over their love of horses. They were both really fine riders. The Reagans invited the Queen and Prince Philip out to their California ranch in March of 1983. It was absolutely miserable. The weather was freezing cold and rainy. There are some hilarious photos of the Queen and Prince Philip looking so miserable. It obviously wasn't what they expected of California weather. They obviously hadn't read Mark Twain. But they did really bond over their love of horses. And here is the Queen with one of her close friends and cousins, Queen Margrethe of Denmark in 2000. The Queen of Denmark is about 6 foot tall, as you can see here, towering over our Queen. And in an interview ahead of Queen Elizabeth II's 90th birthday, Queen Margrethe said, "It's her sense of humor that keeps her looking very good, that keeps her wonderful, in fact." Now, this is one of my favorite images. In 1995, the Queen was welcomed to South Africa by the new President Mandela, just 5 years out of prison. They met again many times and they had a really close friendship. Mandela's personal assistant, fabulous name of Zelda Lagrange, wrote her memoirs. And in it, she wrote, "I was struck by the warm friendship between Madiba and the Queen. Oh, Elizabeth," he would say when he greeted her. And she would respond, "Hello, Nelson." I think he was one of the very few people who called her by her first name, and she seemed to be amused by it. I just love that story. This is with the President of South Korea on her state visit in 2013. Now, she was invited to stay at Buckingham Palace, and her visit was celebrated with a 41-gun salute in Hyde Park. But this was also a very poignant visit because the Queen had also known her father, the former South Korean president, who was assassinated in 1979. And this is a very close friendship that formed, like that with Nelson Mandela. The Queen met President Barack Obama and his wife Michelle for the first time in 2009. And in 2011, the couple were invited to Buckingham Palace. This photograph is from a later visit when he was no longer president, from 2016, when they were invited to visit the Queen and her family at Windsor Castle, arriving by helicopter. At a press conference during this visit, he said of the Queen, "She is truly one of my favorite people." And they did seem to get on really, really well. And if you might remember that Michelle Obama broke protocol and shocked people by hugging the Queen, who didn't seem to mind at all, but all her aides were really furious about it. I'm going to show you a few very sweet pictures of her in private life. This is the Queen and Princess Margaret while they were still both princesses in 1947 as they were on the royal train touring across South Africa. And this is the Queen taking photos on safari in Africa in 1950, a couple of years before she became Queen. She was a really keen photographer. You quite often see her with a video camera or a camera. And this is with Prince Philip on board the destroyer Crusader, bound for British Columbia in Canada during the Commonwealth tour of 1951. Here she is with Prince Charles at Balmoral when he's 3 years old. So this is just the year after she became Queen. And this is her again with a video camera filming from the deck of HMS Gothic. I'm going to show you three more images in fact, before I come and chat to you. This is her in Fiji in 1954, receiving a bouquet from a child in Fiji. This royal tour of 1953 to 54 saw the Queen become the first reigning British monarch to visit Australia, New Zealand, and Fiji. She and her husband traveled over 50,000 miles and visited 14 countries. And it was claimed the luggage weighed around 12 tons and included more than 200 pairs of white gloves. Very important. I want to show you this one from Sydney, Australia in 1954, because it really shows how fashionable the Queen was. And I was made aware of it by my mum when she and I went to a fashion exhibition at the V&A some years ago. And there were lots, it was all British fashion designers, and there were lots of clothes donated from the Queen's and Princess Margaret's collection. And I was amazed at their incredible figures. Look at her tiny waist and how beautiful and high fashion the clothes were, which wasn't what I associated with the Queen. And my mum said, your generation never understand this. When I was a child, they were the supermodels of our time. You know, they were the fashion plates. And when I was writing this book, I discovered how much the Queen and Princess Margaret, in fact, did to put British fashion on the map. This is really what led these 1950s images of her being beamed around the world, of her in high fashion British clothes, is what led to basically the swinging 60s and swinging London, and London being a fashion capital. Most people wouldn't associate that with the Queen, but she really showcased the work of so many incredible British designers that by the 1960s, London was rivaling Paris and Milan. And I'm going to finish on this image, which is one of my favorites. This is the Queen meeting Marilyn Monroe, as far as I'm aware, the only time they met, in 1956 in London. This was at a premiere of a film that Marilyn Monroe wasn't actually in. It was called The Battle of the River Plate. It starred Anthony Quayle and was based on a true World War II story. However, although Monroe was not in the film, she was in London, where she was filming The Prince and the Showgirl. So as a major celebrity, she was, of course, invited to the premiere and then in the royal lineup. She actually spent 4 months in Englefield Green in Surrey on what was her only trip to the UK. And some of you may have seen, there's a wonderful film starring Michelle, what's her name? I can't remember her name. Oh, she plays her so brilliantly. She plays Marilyn Monroe, and it's going to come back to me at some point, and Eddie Redmayne, who plays the young journalist. And it's called My Week with Marilyn, and it's absolutely brilliant. And here is the Queen meeting Marilyn Monroe. They are almost exactly the same age, less than 3 weeks apart in age. And I love that kind of really direct gaze between them. And of course, you can see Marilyn Monroe in what looks like a kind of fabulous metallic lame dress. And the Queen is in black. Now, this was highly unusual because the Queen was almost never allowed to wear black. However, her designers and her kind of stylists and the Queen had a long conversation about this, because this was going to be a Hollywood style premiere. And they said to her, every other woman there is going to be in glittering colors and glitz and glamour. It's going to be all about the kind of the encrusted jewels and the bright dresses. What will make you stand out most is to wear really simple black. And so that's what she did. I find this such a fascinating image. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. I have got other images I can share later, but I just thought I would come back and have a quick look at what's in the chat. And you are also very welcome to unmute yourself.